Starships burn in orbit. Fires consume San Francisco. And through the smoke, a Klingon overseer beams down to Earth. But how did we get here? And is this the last hope for the Federation? Well, I'm going to explore this possibility and a few other hypotheticals in this video about potential conflicts between the Federation and the Klingon Empire. So sharpen your batleths and ready your phasers to kill, because we're about to do some war. In my previous video, I outlined a lot of the strengths and weaknesses surrounding the Klingons and the Federation, and we came to the safe determination that the Klingons are the superior power in terms of conducting a war. But before we talk about any of that, let's briefly talk about how warfare is conducted in Star Trek. So, obviously, there's a huge metaphor between modern or semi-modern naval warfare and the warfare conducted in Star Trek. For example, the cloaking device is basically a U-boat. It allows you to attack undetected, but it also comes at the cost of you being incredibly vulnerable to enemy fire, even though you can't be seen. Much in the way that a U-boat was deadly and could launch lethal strikes from an unseen position, but when hit with a depth charge was basically an expensive coffin. So I think it's safe to say that Star Trek mirrors a lot of World War I era naval combat. However, throughout Star Trek, much of the combat is portrayed a lot like medieval combat, in the way that formations are defined and the way that battle strategies are carried out. So we have a little bit of an interesting blend of both. We see the vast majority of Star Trek warfare represented in the Deep Space Nine series, and quite a number of times we see both of these aspects of warfare coming through. I'm not exactly sure why Star Trek isn't more three-dimensional with the way they conduct warfare. However, I imagine it becomes a little bit difficult to write and then present. So if we're assuming that Star Trek warfare actually works this way, then we have a number of things to think about when it comes to how wars would play out. And I think right here is where we're going to see all of the chickens mentioned in my previous video come home to roost. As mentioned previously, the Klingons do not appear to field a wide variety of ships. Their fleets are rather concise and designed to function well together. Federation, on the other hand, wields an extremely wide variety of ships. They do not appear to have any pre-planned cohesion in mind, and they do not appear to have any set way of operating together. That's not to say that Federation commanders and starships can't form cohesive strategies, or even create and implement new ones. However, their fleets are not designed to do this de facto. Let's put ourselves in the Klingon command chair for a minute. You're a Klingon fleet commander. You have wings of birds of prey that know their formations, that have trained together, that can execute these formations easily. You know these birds of prey's weapons range. You know their engine speed. You probably know a lot about the way they cloak and how cloaking can be used in tactics. Then you have your support ships, which you also know very well. Disruptor arcs, weapons power, number of torpedoes on board. You're able to calculate these quite well, which allows you to implement tactics and strategy with a greater knowledge. Your fleet is also well proportioned as a Klingon officer, with a number of birds of prey ratioed to destroyers, battle cruisers, and battleships. You know your men, you know your ships, you know your capabilities, right off the bat, always. Now let's imagine you're a Federation fleet commander. Your fleet is comprised of a large number of different ships with varying levels of combat capability. You do not have consistent knowledge across the board about these ships, nor do you know how these ships will perform every time in combat unless you are probably the most experienced of tactical officers in Starfleet. You may not know the crew complements, phaser firing arcs, number of photon torpedoes, or rough shield strength of any number of the ships under your command. These ships may have large differences in impulse speed or warp speed, or capability of maintaining warp for long distances. This means that unless you thoroughly know every ship's tactical details, as a Starfleet commander or fleet leader, you will not always be informed as to the exact capabilities of your units. This may not seem like a big detail. However, standardization of armies has been crucial to success throughout our history and the development of modern warfare. So I imagine that in the Star Trek universe, standardization of armed forces would be equally as efficient and necessary. As Starfleet is specifically said to not be a primarily military organization, it makes sense that they would organize their fleets this way. Their fleets are far more versatile for far more purposes. They can do a lot of things with their fleets that other empires can't. However, this leaves them slightly crippled in the field when it comes to their strategy and tactics. The Klingons, on the other hand, seem to operate well-formed fleets that keep formation and use formation in their strikes and attacks. The Klingons are rarely seen outside of formation. I don't think anyone would argue that an army that is consistent in the training of their strategies and tactics will be easy to take on as compared to an army who is untrained in such. One need only look to the history books to see how effective cobbled together forces of varying strengths are compared to forces that have been drilled in formation and tactics. So now that we've briefly gone over all of that, let's jump on to part 2, strategy. On the level of strategy, a standardized army again plays a pretty big role. Strategic level commanders are going to have a great deal of knowledge and insight about the tactical capabilities of the units they're deploying and using. By knowing these units' strengths, weaknesses, and capabilities, they'll be able to better effectively plan their overall strategies. Furthermore, the Klingons seem to use a standardized transport ship, which is not something I focused on in the previous video, but becomes very important here. This standardized transport ship would allow the Klingons to create relatively accurate timetables. The Federation would have a little bit more difficult of a time creating these tables because they'd be using a variety of different ships to transport resources to the front. Not that they wouldn't be able to accomplish this via computer or detailed planning or what have you, but the Klingons are simply able to do it more efficiently faster. Let's move into our third thing here, industrial manufacturing and distribution of military supply. Essentially, the Federation are going to need to create and distribute a wide variety of parts to maintain their fleet, while the Klingon fleet is going to operate using a very narrow variety of parts. Birds of prey are all comprised of the same stuff, so it's going to be easy to design the means of producing birds of prey and scale that up in terms of production. Thus, the parts needed to repair birds of prey in the field are going to be very easy to source and distribute. Because distribution, production, and implementation are focused towards less things, it's going to be easier to get those things manufactured and sent to the front. Again, the Federation does not have the same setup. They have a wider variety of ships they have to maintain that use different designs and are sometimes going to require different parts. So for the purposes of warfare, the Federation is at a significant disadvantage when it comes to supply and distribution on the front lines. This, of course, is also going to affect the deployment and implementation of specialized warships the Federation creates specifically for conflicts. Alright, so we've prattled on for over 7 minutes now. You're probably asking, what is the war going to look like? Well, I'm going to show you what I think are the 3 most likely scenarios, or at least the 3 scenarios that would come up the most if we were to run this through an infinite universe simulator. And then for good measure, we'll explore another couple of options that might branch off of those main ones. Scenario 1. The Klingons sack Earth. This is the one that no doubt big-time Federation nerds will dislike the most. However, I think it is the most likely scenario. Obviously, era matters, so I'd like to note that we're talking about the era before the Dominion War in the Deep Space Nine series. In my opinion, this is the most reasonable to talk about this conflict, and it's probably the one in which there's the most fun options and outcomes. If I had to describe how the Klingons could or would win this war, I imagine it would start out with an all-out assault on the Federation border from Klingon space, headed towards Earth. The Klingons would no doubt overwhelm Federation border forces and destroy defenses along many worlds. I believe the Klingons would penetrate rather deep into Federation space before effective defenses could be mounted. The Federation would most likely try to provide broad and general defenses across the front while they mobilized their fleets from the outer corners of their space. Because Federation territory is so vast, the amount of ships they'd be able to commit to the front would be relatively light by comparison to the amount that Klingons would be able to commit. Because Federation fleets would be comprised of ships dragged in from all over, they would be far less effective than the more cohesive and well-organized Klingon fleets. Right as the Federation would believe they're checking the Klingon advance, the true Klingon hammer would fall. By attacking from both sides, the Klingons would be able to engage in a double envelopment of the hastily put-together Federation fleets, who would be holding the line awaiting reserves. A Klingon thrust towards the neutral zone that functioned as part of a double envelopment but also a forward offensive would push Federation reserves up against the neutral zone, preventing them from engaging in rescue operations. The simultaneous Klingon drive on the left would push Federation forces up against the Cardassian neutral zone and separate forces in the lower portions of the Federation from being able to assist in the defense of Earth. No doubt Federation forces would fall back and attempt to create new lines, but the Klingons would be able to consistently engage in double envelopments, crushing the Federation fleets every time they reorganized. The Federation would try to draw in reserves and would no doubt attack from the neutral zone borders. However, the Klingons would be able to guard them off as they would be devoting much larger amounts of forces to their assaults than the Federation would be to their defenses. With their fleets scattered and cut off and separated throughout their space, the Klingons would be putting greater pressure on them on every front. And of course, the Federation would be forced to maintain some balance of defensive forces along the Cardassian and, more importantly, the Romulan border. By engaging in these simultaneous thrusts, the Klingons would be able to rapidly advance on Earth, Vulcan, and Andor, while simultaneously crushing Federation resistance as it formed up. Once Earth was secure, the Klingons would be free to send their reserves and whatever portions of their armies and fleets they saw fit to subdue any other areas of Federation space they would like. A well-planned and united Klingon assault on the Federation would no doubt be able to crush its defenses and shatter its fleets before it could fully organize and mobilize all of its forces. Now that we've looked at what I think is the most likely option, let's look at what I think is the second most likely option. A protracted war with the Federation that ultimately leads to Federation surrender. This option is essentially part of the plot of yesterday's Enterprise, where the Klingons and the Federation have been fighting for 20 years, and the Federation is currently on the losing side. Captain Picard believes that surrender is inevitable.
The war is going very badly for the Federation, far worse than is generally known. Starfleet Command believes that defeat is inevitable. Within 6 months, we may have no choice but to surrender.
But how could a protracted war with the Klingons occur? Well, the way I see it, if the Federation could detect military buildup on the Klingon border and arrange suitable defenses, they could try to drag the Klingons out in the war to a stalemate. However, I think this plan would ultimately fail. We know the Klingons are capable of fighting long-term wars even against superior opponents like the Dominion, and we know the Klingons' production is easier to maintain than the Federation's production. So, in a long-term protracted war, I believe the Klingons also have the edge against the Federation. I believe a protracted war would begin much in the same way, with an all-out Klingon assault on the border. The ideal situation for a protracted war would be the Klingons spreading their forces out over many fronts, rather than just maintaining defenses along certain areas of their border and concentrating their entire assault on the core of the Federation. If the Klingons committed themselves to too many fronts against well-established Federation defenses, the Federation would be able to bottle up their offensives and stop them from making any serious headway initially. This is where the slugging match would begin. Something the Klingons are better suited to, but something that is happening on Federation soil and on Federation terms. I believe this would level the playing field more than anything. That said, the Federation would not be able to maintain control over all of their territory, and they would have to make strategic and tactical sacrifices. The Klingons would take advantage of this to establish themselves in Federation territory that was unable to be defended and occupied, thus giving themselves access to any resources those areas might provide, as well as any groups that might fight for them. In a long-term war of attrition, I'm guessing that the Cardassians and the Romulans would not try to actively participate, but would seek to actively sabotage the Federation in the hopes of expanding their territory. While they might not seek to openly challenge the Klingon Empire, there may be some element of confrontation between the Klingon Empire and the Romulans. The Romulans would know that with the fall of the Federation, the galactic balance would change greatly. However, I do not believe they would try to drag themselves into a war, but they would rather begin annexing territory to be able to create larger forces and eventually confront the Klingons once the galactic power balance had been reestablished. The Cardassians are a little bit harder to think about in this situation. Ultimately, I believe the Cardassians have a rather high chance of engaging in military action against the Federation, or at least engaging in large-scale annexations of formerly lost territories. In this scenario, I think the poor unfortunate Captain Sisko would be facing armadas of Cardassian ships rather than armadas of Dominion or Klingon ships. Federation morale would play in largely to a long-term protracted war. If the Klingons ever did offer even semi-reasonable terms, the Federation citizens would be forced to address them and would probably ask their leaders to make some kind of compromise. Morale would be something that is easier to affect in the Federation than within the Klingon Empire. The Klingons view losses as honorable, as something that happens in war. The Federation views losses as tragic and a setback. No doubt in a protracted war, Starfleet would start equipping their ships to be more ready for combat and perhaps begin designing new starships and implementing them on the front lines. However, this means that Starfleet and its ships would be in a transitional phase during this long-scale conflict, something that would hinder them greatly, and something that the Klingon Empire does not have to deal with. Eventually, the tides of war would tell against the Federation, and no matter how many years it took, the Federation would have to succumb to the Klingon Empire. Now let's examine option 3. This one might be a little bit goofy, but I actually think overall it's not that unlikely of an option, and that is that Section 31 would intervene and cause a Klingon civil war. Whether they do so before an invasion or after is somewhat irrelevant, but for the purpose of this video, let's assume that they do it after the invasion. A Klingon civil war mid-invasion would weaken the Empire greatly and give the Federation much-needed breathing room and time to consolidate. If Klingon civil war was to break out, it would suddenly shift the focus away from the Federation, and powers like the Romulans might seek to dominate and transform the Klingon conflict so as to cripple the Empire permanently. A Klingon civil war occurring simultaneously as a war with the Federation would result in a mass withdrawal of Klingon forces from the front. My guess is that large portions of the front would collapse outright, and resistance throughout the occupied Federation would drop drastically as fleet commanders join forces with various factions to feud over the Klingon Empire. No doubt many ships would still continue to be engaged within Federation space, however the Federation would now be fighting on much more even terms. Section 31 causing a Klingon civil war would ultimately cripple the Empire greatly. The Federation would most likely be able to reclaim all of its territory, and other empires would look at the Klingons' potential weakness as something they could exploit. A Klingon civil war in the midst of a major military invasion of the Federation would result in a transformation in the Empire and a complete collapse of the attack forces and invasion front, in my opinion. Once the Civil War had settled, the Federation would be in a great position to establish new treaties with the Klingons and create a lasting peace. However, if the Klingons chose to attack again and begin a new war, the Federation would have had much time to consolidate and deploy its forces, thus preventing the Klingons from successfully opening up the fronts they would need to engage in a protracted war. And while this scenario could potentially still devolve into a protracted war, the Federation would be in the best position they could possibly hope for in either case. Alright. So let's riff on a couple of these things and see if we can come up with some potential variations of these scenarios. I think one potential option for a rapid and successful Klingon assault would be a coming war with Cardassia. Once the Klingons established themselves as occupiers and rulers of the majority of Federation territory, they would have access to vast amounts of resources. No doubt enormous parts of Klingon forces would be devoted towards occupation, crushing resistance, and generally suppressing any remainder of the Federation forces. But I think a war with Cardassia would still be on the horizon. Hungry for further victories and greater honors, and with vast amounts of territory already conquered, how could the Klingons not look to destroying the Cardassian Empire, bringing themselves one step closer to full occupation of the Alpha and Beta quadrants, and leaving only the Romulans as a major power to oppose them? While war with Cardassia may not occur right away, its occurrence would no doubt be highly likely. Another potential alternative I see to this scenario where the Klingons engage in a rapid assault of the Federation and overwhelm its defenses quickly is an all-out Cardassian and Romulan combined double offensive. They may view sections of Federation territory near themselves as completely up for grab, and the conflict may devolve into the carving up of the United Federation of Planets. The Klingons probably wouldn't be able to fight a war against the remnants of the Federation, the Romulans, and the Cardassians all at once, so I believe they would be forced to allow some of this annexation and conquest. Ultimately, even if they only captured half of the Federation, I believe that they would be satiated with their gains for the time being, before they began planning their new wars against Cardassia and Romulus. A last potential variation that I view as probably the most unlikely, but it is a possibility, would be a Klingon assault into Romulan territory on the heels of a successful and rapid advance that crushed Federation forces outright. Now, I do not know how well this would succeed. As I have described, the Romulans are somewhat of a paper tiger, and they suffer from an enormous amount of internal turmoil. However, a Klingon assault on Romulan territory is just the thing that would unite the Romulans together. I don't know if the Klingons would be able to fight a fully mobilized Romulan empire on the heels of such a major conflict with the Federation. I suppose it all depends on how successful Klingon forces are, and how ambitious their commanders are. Back to option 2, the protracted war. As likely as it is that Section 31 would intervene in the initial stages of a major conflict, it's also possible that they would be unable to prevent the conflict and be forced to act and devote their resources towards the mid-conflict. If Section 31 could save a large portion of the Federation through shrewd planning and manipulation, or through violent and malicious means, no doubt they would do so. Section 31 may view losing a quarter of the Federation as the only viable option, or Section 31 31 may work towards causing a Klingon civil war in the middle of the conflict if such actions weren't possible in the beginning. A potential variation here that I think is fun but can't exactly pin how likely it might be, let's assume that there's a massive war between the Klingons and Federation, one that lasts for 5 or 6 years, both sides exhausting and depleting themselves, fighting this conflict with everything they have. Meanwhile, on Cardassia, the military could be consolidating power. The military could engage in a massive buildup before assaulting the Federation and the Klingons in the hopes of slicing off a major portion of the quadrant for themselves. Who's to say that the Federation and the Klingons would be prepared to fight the Cardassians? They probably wouldn't be able to ally against them, as the war had gone on for so long that both sides would be bitter and entrenched against each other. The Cardassian factor is a fun thing to think about, because we don't really know what hungry and ambitious Skrulls would do if they had years to build up their forces in the hopes of slicing off nearly half of the Alpha Quadrant for themselves. But we do know that the Cardassians suffer bitternesses against the Federation and long for an empire as powerful as the Klingons. A third outcome, and one that actually has a fair amount of likelihood to occur in my opinion, would be a Romulan assistance with the Federation. I believe the Romulans could potentially be persuaded to join the Federation militarily on the front lines. This may take some sort of prodding from Section 31, or it may be something the Romulans are open to because of the threat of Klingon hegemony in the galaxy. Either way, I think recruiting Romulan forces is definitely on the table during a protracted war scenario. Whether Romulan forces could tilt the table somewhat depends on how strong the Federation is at that time. Alright, let's riff on the idea that Section 31 would intervene to end this war. Option 1, in my opinion. Section 31 just straight up genocides the Klingons. We saw Section 31 do this to the Founders, so I think it's within their power to do something like this to the Klingons. Whether or not Klingon scientists could defeat such viruses or nanobots or whatever they're using remains to be seen. However, Section 31 is very efficient, and I believe that total genocide is not off the table. As a potential addendum to starting a Klingon civil war, Section 31 could try to bring in the Romulans and Cardassians to give them portions of the Klingon Empire, thus shutting down the Klingon threat permanently. Again, I don't think it's above Section 31 to completely annihilate the Klingons, or at least destroy them as an empire. One last interesting potential option to think of here is that Section 31 is cock-blocked by the Obsidian Order or the Tal Shiar, that they attempt to cause a Klingon civil war, but they find out that the Obsidian Order has already planned against it, or that the Tal Shiar has assassinated important agents. Section 31 isn't always infallible, and I think we have to consider the possibility that they intervene, but fail. Well, we hopped all over the place, but I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm going to be coming out with more stuff soon. There's just been a lot going on, so I haven't been able to release things very rapidly. So look out for more stuff in more rapid succession coming up in the future. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.